Hello, I am Carol Lee Dean, author of Story Frames for Teaching Literacy, Enhancing Student Learning Through the Power of Storytelling. And with me today, I have three authors whose books appear in my book, Story Frames. Vonda Michaud Nelson, Lois Ruby, Caroline Starr Rose. Amy Miller, who has written a chapter for my book, will hopefully be joining us, but she's the head of the Mays School in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and as often happens in school settings, she had to cover for a teacher and may be chiming in late, or else we will do a video with her on another day. So in my book, I analyzed 32 different children's books because the ability to understand the structure of stories helps children with understanding stories and being able to create their own stories. And I have featured some of my favorite children's authors. Today we're talking to three New Mexico children's authors. And although my book is primarily for educators, we are going to be talking about tips for leisure reading today. We will start with Vonda, and she'll be talking about Bad News for Outlaws.
Thank you, Carol Lee, and thank you, Caroline, for holding up my book. Let me tell you a little bit about Bad News for Outlaws. There's so much to admire about Bass Reeves, my main character. His strength, his fearlessness and skill with weapons, his clever use of disguises, his phenomenal memory, and his sense of duty and honor. Character, that was the main thing that drew me to this man. As a slave, Bass had been denied an education, so he was unable to read or write. Yet he overcame this handicap. Truly dedicated to his work, Bass had the warrants read to him and memorized the shapes of the letters for each. Even when given up to 30 arrest warrants to serve, he never brought in the wrong man. Over his 32-year career as a deputy U.S. Marshal, Bass Reeves arrested more than 3,000 criminals. Imagine an illiterate slave who rose to become the most feared and respected lawman of his time. Remarkable.
Vonda, something I really love about your book, and I love sharing this with my struggling readers because I'm a speech language pathologist, a certified academic language therapist, and I specialize in working with students with dyslexia, is sharing that he was illiterate. Bass Reeves was not able to read or write.
Yes, that was one of the things that amazed me too about the accomplishments of this man.
And so next up is Caroline. And she has two books, and actually maybe your main character has difficulty with reading as well.
Yes, she does. And this is actually, Vaughn, when does Bass Reeves take place?
That's in the late 1800s, early 1900s, sort of around the turn of the century.
Okay, so this is a decade or two before Bass, but Maybe is a historical verse novel, and it takes place in 1870s Kansas on the frontier. And I'm sure that many of you have heard of verse novels before. Maybe some of you have read them, but just in case you're not familiar, let me give you a little peek here. So instead of prose, the book is written in poetry. So you can see here two different poems. Instead of chapters, we have poems. Instead of paragraphs, we have stanzas. So this makes the book a pretty quick read, but I promise you there's a lot packed into these pages. May is a 12-year-old girl who really enjoys learning, but she struggles with school. She struggles at school. And as Carol Lee said, she has dyslexia, though no one at that time would have understood this. May's family's in a difficult situation financially, and so they decide the best thing for them to do to bring money into the family is to pull May out of school for a few months and to send her out to be with a new family and work as their maid. This is not something she wants to do, but it's something that she has to do. And her father takes her to the new home. The family lives 15 miles away. It's a young couple, newly married, and her father promises that he will pick her up by Christmas time. Well, in the first few days May is with this family, she realizes things aren't very good between them. And the new wife decides she's going to leave and go back to Ohio, where she's from. And the husband tells May, "I'm off to find my wife. I'll be back soon." Hours turn into days, days turn into weeks, and May realizes she is all alone. As the months pass and her food supplies dwindle and a blizzard is bearing down, May knows she's only 15 miles from home, but there's no way to communicate that with her family, that she's alone. She has no bicycle, no cars are invented at this point in time. And so she has to make it on her own. I'm not going to tell you anymore what happens next, but have a read if you like survival stories.
And I actually have two of your books featured in Story Frames. The other one is A Race Around the World, which is a factual, narrative nonfiction picture book.
Yes. And again, it's really similar, or it's interesting how Vaughn's book and my two books are all kind of in a very similar time period. So this book takes place in 1889, and it starts in New York City. So this is at a time when only 2% of all the journalists in the country were women. This was just, and the women that worked as journalists were mainly given stories to write about sewing or society, a gathering of people. No, nothing that was considered hard-hitting news. Yet we have this woman here named Nellie Bly, who was not interested in writing those types of stories. And she decided that she was going to try, she came up with a challenge for herself. There was a very interesting book that was very popular at this time called, I'm blanking on Jules Verne's book.
Around the World in 80 Days?
Thank you, Carolee. Around the World in 80 Days. Thank you. And Nellie decided, this is a work of fiction. So in the fictional book, a character named Phileas Fogg traveled the world in 80 days. Now to us, we can get in an airplane and make it around the world in maybe a day and a half with delays and these sorts of things in airports. But that would have been unbelievable to travel the world in 80 days in 1889. That would have just been lightning quick. And so Nellie decided to see if she could make the actual journey, but do so even faster. She studied train routes and ship schedules and figured out she could make the trip on her own in 76 days. So she went to her boss at the newspaper where she worked in New York. The newspaper was called The World. And she said to him, I think this would make a great news story. I would like to travel the world and see if I can beat the fictional character Phileas Fogg. And her boss said, this is a fabulous idea, but no woman could ever make the trip. Women always need chaperones. Women couldn't travel alone at that time, and they always take far too much luggage. Nellie said, I'll travel by myself, and I'll only take one bag. I'll only take what I can carry. And her boss said, that's a great idea, but I still don't think you're the right person for it. I really think a man should make this trip. And she said, okay, you start a man for this newspaper. I'm going to find another newspaper here in town to hire me. I will make the trip, and I will beat the man that you pick to race against me. She was told she could do it a year later. Nellie had a few hours to prepare for her trip, and she was off. Now, even less time to prepare was this journalist named Elizabeth Bisland, who worked for a magazine in New York City as well. And she woke up to find out that this woman, Nellie, had gone on a trip, was racing around the world, and the boss at her magazine decided, oh, I have a lady journalist on my staff. What if we turn this race into a race against two women instead of a race against time? So Elizabeth was told, you'll be getting on a train this evening and you'll be racing Nellie Bly around the world. One woman went east, one woman went west. They both beat the 80-day record, but I'm not going to tell you who the winner was. You'll have to read on that.
Thank you. And I just have to add that I have an interview with Caroline and another interview with Lois that I'm going to link on this blog, because we've had lots of lively conversations about plotters versus pantsers. And I am definitely a plotter. In my book, Story Frames, I talk all about plot and what plot means and how plot is organized. And I have all my cards, my note cards when I plot a book, because I also write young adult fiction. But not all authors write that way. And so, and just because I've analyzed their books according to a certain plot analysis, I don't want to presume that that is how they plotted their books. And so we have some lively conversations about that and some interviews with them where they'll speak specifically about that. Now let's talk about Lois and your book. Now, Maybe and Steal Away Home are both works of fiction based on historical settings, whereas A Race Around the World and Bad News for Outlaws are true events, true people. And I know that you and Vonda did a lot of research for that, but I know that you also did a lot of research for Maybe, and that Lois did a lot of research, even though your book, Steal Away Home, is a fictional story.
Yes, well, I want to show you two covers. This is the original cover, which I thought was lovely, done by a real artist. This is the current cover, which looks more like Scooby-Doo meets Nancy Drew, but nevertheless, this is the one that kids read these days. So I want you, yes, it is historical fiction. And yes, I am a pantser. I do not plot things out in advance. I do a ton of research, but I never know where the story is going to go. And in fact, the last thing I want to know is the ending, because I don't write to the ending. I just keep the story going. And then it tells itself to me the way it needs to be told, I hope. So imagine in this book, imagine that you have moved into a creepy old house in Lawrence, Kansas. And it has ugly rooster wallpaper, and you strip off the wallpaper, and behind the wallpaper, there's a hole in the wall. Now, if there's a hole in the wall, obviously you're going to have to look through that hole, aren't you? And what do you find on the other side? A secret room with a skeleton in it, and it's laid out flat on an ancient cot. It turns out to be the remains of a runaway slave. Her name is Elizabeth Charles. She was called Miss Lisbeth. Now, again, this is a made-up person, you understand. And she ran from a plantation that had enslaved her family for generations. But this is what Dana, a 12-year-old girl in the current time, finds in this old house. And then the story jumps back from Dana's time in the present to James's time in 1856. I don't know why we're all so fascinated by the 1800s, but in 1856, there is James, who lives in the very same house that Dana lived in, and he knows how that skeleton got there. Now, why is it in Kansas? Well, that's the easy part, because Kansas was established in 1854 as a free territory. It was a place where slavery was never, ever to be allowed, and where a person who had once been enslaved could run to and live in freedom and dignity. But it didn't always work that way. And here's Miss Lisbeth. You don't see her on this cover, but you do see her on this cover. Here's Miss Lisbeth, who after 160 years is discovered there in this room. The question is, was she sealed in that room after she died? Or was she still breathing when that wall was built? So yes, this is an historical novel, and it's about a woman's dangerous quest and mission to be free. We all have this within us, the need to be free. And it is also about the courage of ordinary people to do the right thing, even when the right thing is so much harder to do than anything else. And above all, it's a story for readers to puzzle over and to ask the question of themselves, to ask, how heroic would I be if I were in the same circumstances?
Thank you. I've read all these books and now I just want to read them again. And they're so engaging and so wonderful. And I love so much that they tie to real events. And not always real people, sometimes real people, but real events and our real historical heritage. Now, shifting gears from the book specifically, I want to talk a little bit about leisure reading, and especially with summer coming up, some tips for summer reading. And my esteemed author friends here are not just authors. Lois and Vonda are retired librarians. Caroline was a previous school teacher. And so they have a lot of experience with making books exciting for kids, not just their own books, but other books as well. And so we're going to have a little chat. And I have a PDF that's downloadable on my blog that will list some of these things a little bit more succinctly, but we're going to have a little chat about some tips for summer reading. And I'll show those tips at the end. But right now, let's just have a discussion. And the first tip is be a book lover. And what being a book lover means is showing our kids that we love books, that we are excited about books, that our actions speak louder than words, that reading is important to us. When we have leisure time, how often do our kids see us picking up a book? Do you guys have anything else to say about that?
Yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I've often, when I worked in the library and talked to parents about reading aloud to their children, one of the things I often found myself saying was, if you tell your child to go read and then you sit down and watch television, that is not setting an example for letting them see how much you value reading and that it is fun and a wonderful way to spend your leisure time.
And I want to add something you will see when you read Carol Lee's tips, that she talks about when you travel, that kids have a book to read on the plane, or that, you know, they're entertained, not just with their electronic things. But I want to tell you about when my kids were little, we would take road trips and I would go to the library and get a huge box of books, all different kinds of books for all different ages. And I would just put them in the back of the, you know, in those days we had, kids could just run loose in the car. And I'd put them in the back, and there were enough books that a kid could pick one up and say, no, I don't want to read this. Oh, but wait, I might want to read this one. So that's a real good trick, not just on a trip, is to have a huge variety of books available for kids and then let them choose what they really want.
And the next tip, number 2, kind of goes along with that, and that is providing access to books and other reading materials. And so consider when you are on that trip and you're going off and seeing the sights of wherever you're traveling to, why not make one of those places a bookstore or a library? And get your kids their own library cards. Show them that the places that books appear are fun and exciting places to be.
Yes.
And I know that, Vonda, you mentioned maybe getting a magazine subscription.
Yes, I think sometimes people forget about magazines, but there are many of the children's magazines now have gone online, but there are still print magazines. And I think it's wonderful for a child to have a subscription that's their own. And every month they wait for that magazine to come. And certainly that's going to encourage their reading because it's sort of a sense of ownership for them.
And let's not forget, you can go to garage sales and find books too.
Absolutely.
And you can order any book from your local bookstore. So if you go into a bookstore and the book you want is not available, they are always happy to order it for you.
And you can order books that the library doesn't have through interlibrary loan.
Next tip, number 3, is encourage exploration. And I'm gonna let Caroline take the lead on this one.
You know, a lot of us are avid readers. I think I could look at all 4 faces on the screen here, and we would definitely agree that librarians, teachers, most of us, I hope all of us, really hold reading as one of the most important parts of our lives. And if we want to encourage our children to become lifelong readers, then I think we need to encourage them, allow them to read as we often read, because sometimes I think we forget how we often read. Sometimes we might try out a book, and if it doesn't suit us or it's not something that engages us, we'll set it aside. Sometimes we like to return again and again to a book that we have read before, but is something that we've enjoyed so much we want to revisit the characters or the place. And we allow ourselves to sample and to dabble and to try a lot of different things. Imagine a library or a bookstore perhaps being like a buffet table where you might want to sample all sorts of different tastes and types of books. And so I really encourage parents and teachers and kids to think about reading in this way too. There are so many things to choose from. Some are going to be challenging. Some things are going to be nostalgic, make you think of other, your younger days. Some things will be exciting. Some things might be sad, but these are all different experiences that we can have through books. And I think that the broader our exposure and the more time we have to explore in the choices that we make, the more satisfying our reading experiences will be, and the more likely we will be raising lifelong readers.
So the next tip kind of feeds into that. It's read books together. Now, I work with a lot of students who are struggling readers, students with dyslexia. And when we're doing the hard work of reading in school, a lot of times we're focused on very controlled text. We teach them a syllable pattern, and then we work on reading books focused or stories focused on that syllable pattern. And what Caroline's talking about is for leisure, we want to break free and remind kids of what subjects they love, what subjects they want to explore. And so for students that are struggling readers, though, the text may be a bit of a challenge for them. And we don't want them to revert back to habits of just guessing at words, because they're not really reading the book when they do that. And so one way that, now if your child has an IEP or a 504 plan, they may have audiobooks accessible through bookshare.org or Learning Ally that you may want to investigate. But whether they have that accessible and whether they have audiobooks accessible to them or not, I think one of the best things that we can do is just read together with our kids, no matter what their ability level and no matter what their age. Some of my fondest memories are reading with my son, high school student, when he was in honors English, and we would read a page of Mice and Men. We listened to The Grapes of Wrath on a road trip one summer, and sharing books by either reading aloud or listening to books on road trips exposes kids to sentence structure and vocabulary that is far beyond what they can decode or read themselves, so that when they come to that in their own reading, they recognize these words through these rich reading experiences. And I know you all have something to say about book sharing.
I just want to add to that. Before this year, I've never lived near any of my grandchildren. So it's been a real joy to be able to read to my grandchildren that live a distance away. And one of my granddaughters, who's 8, is dyslexic. And we ask her to read to us when she wants to, because, grandparents have endless amounts of patience. And so she doesn't get us frustrated reading to us, because we will just wait until she gets to where she needs to be in the story.
And with regard to the idea of reading together and reading aloud, if you aren't convinced that it matters whether or not you read to and with your child, you will be after reading this amazing book. Reading Magic, why reading aloud to your children will change your life forever. One of the things that the author Mem Fox stresses is that leisure reading should be just that: leisurely, carefree, and time to lighten up, have fun, and bond. I agree completely with this. And she speaks from personal experience of how she started reading to her own children, and the kinds of things that happened, the magical things that happened between them and because of this time together. I'd also recommend a book called The Reading Promise, My Father and the Books We Shared by Alice Ozma. And this is about a relationship between a young girl and her father, a true story. In fourth grade, she and her father decided to challenge themselves and to read together 100 consecutive nights. They accomplished that, and they had so much fun doing it. They decided to keep it going. They read to each other every day until she graduated from high school and went off to college. So it's just a marvelous book to share and inspirational if you want to read your child. And as I said, have questions about whether or not you should, this will convince you otherwise.
I'll just add to that, I'm a mom of 2 boys. They are almost grown at this point, and my sweetest memories are reading to them. I used to say my favorite thing to do was to find 2 boys, a book, and a blanket. And we would just spend hours with our 50 books that we would bring back from the library. That was the limit, a 50 book limit. And we would just pour over those books. And just to add to what Lois and Vaughn have said, and Carolee, reading aloud is a really safe way to explore the world. I heard Catherine Patterson once say that reading is a dress rehearsal for life. And so those experiences that your children might eventually have, or those experiences you hope they will never have, you can all experience together through literature. And it's really a safe way to kind of explore some of those things and to have some good discussions. And sometimes you don't even need to have a discussion at all. Simply experiencing the story together
Absolutely.
is a really special thing. And the story can stand on its own.
And that
Yes.
kind of goes into the next one, the last point number 5, make reading connections. And what you're saying about, do we have a conversation? This is leisure reading. So we don't want to read a book and then quiz our children and drill them and ask them questions and give them a multiple choice test. However, if we model when we have questions, self-questioning, because self-questioning is a huge part of reading. And when we as adults read with our kids and then we model for them how we ask questions of ourselves. So rather than asking questions of them, we can say, oh, I'm wondering what's going to happen next in this story. I predict that this is going to happen. Or sometimes it's very valuable to say, I am confused. I'm not sure who this paragraph is talking about. I need to go back and look. Oh, now I found out. Now I know what's going on. When we have those types of informal conversations with our kids, we're letting them into our thinking. It's a think aloud where we let them know how good readers think about books. And so as we model that for them with their reading, then they realize that going back in a text to look for information or asking yourself questions about what's going on or clarifying your understanding is what good readers do naturally. And so to model that in a leisurely context lets them know that we're not just asking questions at school. We're not just asking questions when there's a test. We're always asking questions.
And I had some in my years this is like moving a little bit off of that, but I did want to share some ideas I had for people who want to kind of make reading kind of central to everything they do. In my years as a children's librarian, I found many ways to engage and connect kids by using books as springboards for fun activities. And like an example would be, and I brought this book, Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, which is one of my faves, by William Steig. Or you could read something like Everybody Needs a Rock by Byrd Baylor, or even the traditional Stone Soup book, all books about rocks and stones. And then after reading them, or even throughout the time reading them, you could do things like go on a rock hunting hike and use some rock guidebooks there perhaps, play hopscotch with stones, make stone soup together. Do an art project like maybe rock painting or rock polishing or make rock magnets or something. Eat Rocky Road ice cream to celebrate your reading. I mean, there are just a lot of connections you can make, and then you could just choose your own theme and have fun. Like a book like Pete the Cat and His Four Groovy Buttons, you could try some things to do with buttons. There's just so many wonderful ways that you can like take your reading experience together beyond that and keep it going in that way. And one of the other things that I really love doing to make book connections and language connections is I love poetry. And books by children's literature champion Carolyn Feller-Bauer are gold mines for ideas for sharing books. But one of the best things
Think we lost Vonda. And as you'll notice, she's in her car. And I forgot to have her tell you all that she is in her car because she's in front of the library. I was just telling them,
yes,
we lost you for a minute, that you're in your car because you are actually at the library right now.
yes, I'm getting their Wi-Fi in the parking lot because we can't go in yet because of COVID, and I'm not online at home. So, but anyway, with regard to Poetry Break, the concept is simple. First, you create a sign that reads Poetry Break, and this is just a mini one, and you then you choose a poem. You don't have to, but I always put on a hat of some kind. And you walk into the designated space, your living room or kitchen perhaps, hold up your sign, and I have a big one, but I made this little one for this video, and say Poetry Break. Read your poem with feeling, and maybe you might have another prop. Like here, might be something like, here I've got this little ice cream cone. August ice cream cone. Lick quick. Read your poem with feeling, of course, and then exit the space. And an important rule in this is that the poem is not to be used as a prompt for a lesson afterwards. This is just purely poetry appreciation, a moment to be enjoyed, just like leisure reading should be a moment to be enjoyed. So.
All right, now I'm going to just show this little handout that we have. So it's a little downloadable on my blog. This is the first page, and then these are our tips. Thank you so much for talking about your books. Thank you for sharing these reading tips. And at the bottom here, there is a connection if you want to learn more about story frames at the Brooks Publishing website. And do you have any last words that you want to share about reading aloud? Please let us know if you do. My only thing is have fun. The most important thing we want to do is show kids that reading is fun. And the more they struggle with reading, the more important it is to know, what is all this hard work for? It is for engaging in books. Thank you, and enjoy a summer of reading.